Well, like most of you here probably are, I'm a history buff. The History Channel is my favorite channel, and I'll admit I even watch the military channel. But so I welcome any opportunity to share in an evening where we get to listen to or listen about two great men. And I welcome this opportunity to go, as they say, behind the scenes and between the lines about the lives of these two great men. Joining me to do that is John Stauffer, a leading scholar of the Civil War era and chair of the history of American civilization at Harvard University. And he's author of Giants, the Parallel Lives of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. His first book, though, The Black Hearts of Men, Radical Abolitionist and the Transformation of Race, was a winner of several awards, including the 2002 Frederick Douglass Award. And that's given for outstanding books on slavery or abolition. As a matter of fact, it's one of the most prestigious awards given for history writing. The book, or rather John's book, The State of Jones, co-authored with Sally Jenkins of the Washington Post, was a New York Times bestseller and nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. His essays have appeared in Time Magazine, New York Post, and the Harvard Review, naturally. He served as consultant to numerous Civil War films and documentaries. John's award-winning book, Giants, The Parallel Lives of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, started out actually as an essay, but fortunately for us, it turned into a very stunning book about a portrait of two great self-made men. John, thank you so much for sharing with us this evening.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you for that. Thank you for that very generous introduction. Thank you, Sal, for inviting me. It's an honor. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here.
Well, this book, Giants, reveals, or you indicate that it reveals, Lincoln's relationship with Douglass is really a very important part of Lincoln's legacy. So what was it that first joined Lincoln and Douglass in your mind as perhaps peers, and you wanted to explore that?
Yeah, so what first joins Douglass and Lincoln together? Two things, really. One is their background, and two is their understanding of the Union in the context of the Civil War. I argue that Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln are the two preeminent self-made men in American history. They started their lives at the dregs of society. Frederick Douglass as a slave, Lincoln was referred to as poor white trash. Douglass has zero formal education, Lincoln has less than a year of formal education. And they both rise up to become among the greatest nonfiction writers. Lincoln, in my mind, is the greatest president in American history, and Douglass is the most famous black man in the world before the age of 40 and is widely considered to be one of, if not the greatest public speaker and writer in his day. And this was a time in which to be an effective public speaker was analogous to being a professional athlete, a rock star, a musician, because public speaking is one of the only forms of entertainment. And that self-making was seen as a great virtue, as a great accomplishment. And when they first met, they knew of each other as self-made men, and they had great respect for each other as self-made men. They admired each other's struggle upward. Both of them retained some semblance of their accents when they first met at the White House. Douglass was the first black man to meet with and advise a U.S. president. He met with Lincoln 3 times in the White House. The next time a black man met with and advised a U.S. president was when Martin Luther King Jr. met with and advised Lyndon Johnson 9 times. The reason for them coming together as friends primarily was utilitarian. Douglass devoted his life to ending slavery and to trying to achieve equality under the law for all Americans. He was nothing if not a radical and a revolutionary, because to embrace racial equality, to embrace equality under the law for all Americans at this time was seen as truly revolutionary. Lincoln was first and foremost a politician, and he was a brilliant politician. And as president, Lincoln's chief aim was to preserve the Union.
You know, I'm sorry, I was just going to say, you could really call them both freedom fighters.
Exactly.
But you know what? They started fighting real young, though, like even when they were youngsters.
Yes.
Both of them had a very interesting fight that was a turning point.
That's right.
For each of them.
That's
You
right.
want to share that
That's
with
right.
us?
So let me just say that their friendship ultimately hinged on the fact that both understood that to win the war and preserve the Union meant ending slavery. The goal of winning the war was inseparable from the goal of ending slavery. And both Lincoln and Douglas believed in and embraced freedom as much as anyone. Lincoln frequently said, I hate slavery as much as any abolitionist, and there's no reason to doubt that. They are, in their self-making and rising up, one of the main turning points was a fight, a vicious fight. One of the parallels in their lives is that both Douglas and Lincoln grew up in vicious communities. Douglas as a slave, in which without violence or the threat of violence, slavery is impossible. Lincoln grew up in the backwoods of Illinois and Indiana, and these were communities in which the defining notion of manhood was the ability to drink a lot and fight viciously. And Douglas and Lincoln fell in love with language, as poor as the downtrodden, as the growing up in the dregs of society. They both latched on to the power of words, the power of language. They both read and cut their eye teeth, almost memorized the same 6 books or authors. So ironically, at the very moment in which they're falling in love with words, with books, and defining themselves as intellectuals, they get into a vicious fight. For Lincoln, it was right after he turns 21, he had a bad relationship with his father. In fact, Lincoln said, the first 21 years of my life I was a slave because I had to turn over every penny to my father, and by law, a poor white boy did have to turn over every penny to his father.
And didn't he rent him out? The father rent?
Yes. And
Abraham Lincoln out?
Legally, a white father could rent out his son to work. And the son had to turn over every penny to the father. And so when Lincoln comes of age, meaning legally when you turn 21, you can leave your father and go on your own. Lincoln moves to New Salem, Illinois. And both Douglas and Lincoln and other parallels, they're both blessed with being very big and very strong. Lincoln is 6'4" in his bare feet, at a time when the average height of men is 5'7". Douglas is 6'1" and very burly and muscular. And so Lincoln moves to New Salem. It's this backwoods town, and one of the leaders was a local tough who felt threatened by Lincoln. Jack Armstrong was his name. And Jack Armstrong and his buddies liked to lure strangers into poker games, steal their money and beat them up and send them on their way. Jack Armstrong was known for enjoying roasting a live pig and listening to its squeal as it died. So Armstrong challenges Lincoln to a fight. And Armstrong challenges Lincoln to a no-holds-barred rough and tumble. It was a kind of fight in which it was not uncommon for an opponent to have a part of your nose bitten off or your ear bitten off. And the great prize in a rough and tumble was to liberate your opponent's eyeball and keep it as a trophy. Wow. That's how vicious these fights were. And there were men in New Salem who were missing an eye. And Lincoln, who didn't like fighting, said, no way I'm going to fight you in a rough and tumble. I'll agree to a regulated wrestling match, which was more subdued. Now, it's unclear what happened in that fight because of the haze of memory, and if public speaking was one of the great forms of entertainment, so was fighting. People came from all around to witness this fight. A lot of money was changed hands. People gambled on it. And the best we know is that Armstrong fouled Lincoln. Lincoln called the foul. They called the fight a draw. And in the immediate wake of that, Armstrong befriends Lincoln, and what the fight does for Lincoln is that it makes him understand that he can be a leader in his community. And Lincoln says that fight was the turning point in my young life.
Because he did get a lot of recognition.
He got a lot
became
of
a hero.
recognitions. He becomes a hero.
Right.
He's suddenly embraced by the local leader. Within 6 months, Lincoln is elected captain of his company in the Black Hawk War. And then within less than a year after that, he begins his long journey into politics. It is a crucial turning point.
And what about Douglas's
For
fight?
Douglas, his fight occurred when he returns to the eastern shore of Maryland, where he had been born, having spent time in Baltimore, in which he was able to learn to read and write. And one of the things that literacy gives to a slave is a sense of pride and dignity. So when Douglas returns to the eastern shore, he looks his master in the eye, he stands up to his master, he talks back to his master. His name was Thomas Auld, and Thomas Auld said, "This is unacceptable." So he hires Douglas out to a man in the Eastern Shore known for his reputation of breaking the will of slaves. His name was Edward Covey. And Douglas was hired out for a year to work for Edward Covey. And Douglas said for the first 6 months, Covey whipped him mercilessly at least once a week. The welts on his back were as thick as his thumb, and they had not yet healed when he received another whipping.
And whipping for nothing.
For
Not
nothing.
that he did anything.
For
He
nothing.
was
Just
standard
arbitrarily whipped. And Covey's goal to maintain his reputation is to break the will of the slave. And Douglas says that he became a brute. He lost his manhood, became a brute. After enduring the sadism for 6 months, he decides to stand up to Covey and fight him and challenge him, and that he was not going to let Covey whip him again. And Douglas says, even if I die, I'm going to stand up and fight him. They have a two-hour epic fight. Now, to give you a sense of Douglas's personality, Douglas understands that if he were to kill or seriously maim Covey, which he could have because Covey's only 5'7" and pretty scrawny, he then would have been killed or dismembered or sent into Mississippi. Instead, he primarily parries Covey's blows, goes on the defensive, and after 2 hours, Covey just gets tired and gives up. And Douglas famously says that Covey was mastered by a boy of 16. And from that moment forward, Douglas says that I was a free man in form, even if I would remain a slave, in fact. And in essence, Douglas devotes the rest of his life to freedom, not only for himself, but for other people. And Douglas defines that fight as the turning point in his life.
What were some of the other things that they did to remake themselves?
The most important ones were the fight, literacy. Both Douglas and Lincoln, it was almost an awakening, almost like a conversion experience where they understood the power of the word. That words were the most effective and powerful weapon that they had. And both of them virtually memorized the Bible, Shakespeare, Lord Byron, Robert Burns, Aesop's Fables, and the Columbian Orator. That was indispensable because literacy gives an individual a sense of dignity, a sense of pride, an ability to analyze oneself and one's world. It was absolutely indispensable. Both of them also married up. The women in their lives were absolutely indispensable to their success. Douglas marries a free woman, a woman who had never been a slave, Anna Murray. In my view, without Anna Murray, Douglas never could have become free because Anna Murray worked as a domestic in Baltimore. It was her money that allows Douglas to purchase a train ticket, which takes him to New York and freedom. It's her money that allows him to dress up as a free black sailor, and it's her money that allows Douglas to purchase the equivalent of a passport, which shows him as a free black man, which he gives to the conductor. And then when Douglas starts his career as a public speaker for the Abolition Society, it's Anna Murray who's working as a domestic while raising their 3 kids to help support the family because Douglas doesn't make enough as a lecturer to support the family. So without Anna Murray, Douglas's career would have halted quickly.
And yet he never once gave her credit.
And yet he never once gave her credit. That's exactly right.
I'm really upset about that.
And what's ironic is that even
never
though
even mentioned her.
Never mentions her, and yet Douglas was the foremost male feminist of his day, which is another irony. Now, to put the fact that he never gives her credit in perspective, Douglass first becomes famous for his slave narrative, his autobiography. This was a genre that was very popular. Douglass becomes famous almost overnight on the strength of his best-selling autobiography. And there was a tradition of autobiographical writing by men, by white men, and white men never mentioned their wives. They didn't mention the women. They talked about how they rose up on their own merit and with the help of God and a few other factors. But women were not part of that. And Douglass, in a sense, understood that if he wants his book to do well, and if he wants to expand the notion of the self-made man to incorporate black men, which he does, and that in itself is a radical, a revolutionary gesture. To say that my evolution was impossible without my wife,
Right.
that would have destroyed the book.
Wouldn't be that much self-made.
Yes,
huh?
it wouldn't be. And
But there are two other women very helpful in Douglass's life
Yes,
also.
yes.
Ottilie.
Ottilie Ossing, who was a brilliant intellectual, and she was from Germany. She was a German Jewish intellectual who was an avid abolitionist. They had a real intellectual, intimate friendship. In fact, they were something of soulmates. Anna Murray Douglass's wife, one of the reasons for the distance is that Anna Murray remained mostly illiterate.
Even though she was a very smart
Even
woman.
she was a very smart and very savvy
Piano,
woman.
I mean, played the violin
Yes,
and everything.
yes.
Why didn't she learn to read? Because I wonder if it was not maybe because she didn't want to outshine Douglass, maybe because she
That's
was,
a great question. Why didn't Anna Murray learn to read? She was, in every other respect, just as smart as Douglass.
Right.
I think that it was a period in which, this was a period in which women couldn't vote. Women had very few rights. Women were not allowed to own property. And I also think that Anna Murray's raising 4 kids. She's raising 4 kids.
She doesn't have time to learn how to read.
She doesn't have time. She's raising 4 kids. She's ironing Douglass's clothes. She's basically keeping the house. She doesn't have time. Douglass was such, in a sense, a deadbeat dad that, he's on the road so much that his 4-year-old son doesn't even recognize him. But that was tradition.
Right,
that was
right,
standard.
okay.
So I think it's a combination that Anna Murray knows she doesn't want to compete with Douglass because Douglass is immensely competitive, and she's got her hands full
And so he does then have this 28-year relationship
with
the
Ottilie
German,
Ossing,
right.
who is there's speculation by some scholars that they have a sexual relationship, we
well,
don't
she
know.
definitely lived at the house.
She lived at the house,
Which
and
was
Anna Murray felt
interesting.
threatened by her. In my view, Douglass was nothing if not prudent. And Douglass definitely understood that if he got Ottilie Ossing pregnant, that's the end of his career. It's the end of his career. So whatever happened physically, Douglass made sure that that wasn't going to leave the bedroom door, so to speak. But then Julia Griffiths, who is a British woman who came to the United States, she taught Douglass grammar. She taught Douglass how to edit a newspaper because Douglass has no formal training. Douglass said that it was Julia Griffiths' blue markings that taught him the rules of grammar, taught him how to edit a newspaper. And Douglass truly, from 1838 when he becomes free until 1845 when he becomes world famous on the strength of his autobiography, the growth there is extraordinary. But from 1845 to 1855, a close friend of Douglass, the African-American intellectual James McCune Smith, says that Douglass changes more from 1845 to 55 than he does from 1838 when he's a slave, or 1835 when he's a slave, to 1845, which gives you a sense of Douglass's radical, extraordinary evolution.
And exposure, he's traveling and living in England
Yes,
and so forth.
yes. And now Lincoln, most Lincoln scholars dismiss Mary Todd Lincoln as a lunatic, a madwoman in the attic. And yet Mary
But she was very bright also.
She was brilliant. She was
very
savvy.
political?
Very political. Mary Todd Lincoln knew more about Whig politics than Lincoln did. Mary Todd Lincoln grew up in an estate in Kentucky that was right next to Henry Clay. Now, Henry Clay was Lincoln's hero of a statesman. Mary Todd sat on Henry Clay's knee as a 10-year-old girl. Mary Todd and Lincoln first came together because of their passion for Whig politics. Mary Todd actually dated Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's great rival. And the reason that she ditched him is because he was a Democrat and he was unwilling to convert to Whig politics.
And she was determined she was going to marry a president.
And she was
though.
determined she was going to marry a Whig and a future president. So they came together over the presidential election of 1840, and she advised Lincoln in every step of his political career. So the women in their lives were truly indispensable. And Mary Todd was an aristocrat. Both married up.
Well, why did you say initially that people called her a Mad Hatter? Why was she? I mean, I know there were rumors about spiritualism.
Yeah, she was a spiritualist. She invited mediums to the White House. Spiritualist meaning that she believed that one could communicate with the dead, particularly deceased children. But this was widespread. This was immensely common. There were millions of fervent spiritualists. In fact, there's some evidence that Frederick Douglass was a spiritualist, that participated in a seance. So spiritualism might seem crazy to us today, but it was certainly not at the time. Mary Todd was also, I mean, she was a pistol. She was a fire woman. She made her opinions and her thoughts be known. And this was a time that if you were a woman and you spoke publicly, the term most used to characterize you was promiscuous. Women were not supposed to be public speakers. Promiscuous, it's like saying you're a little tart to speak publicly. The true place of a woman in this society was in the home, to keep the home pure, to keep the home chaste, to try to prevent your husband from sinning. That was the understanding, the domestic sphere.
But reiterating though, she was his intellectual equal.
Absolutely.
She was brilliant in politics.
Yes.
Yet he needed someone else though who could remake him in terms of his, civilization, if you will.
Yes.
His good friend Joshua.
Joshua Speed, who, in a sense, civilized him. Lincoln, because of Lincoln's upbringing, he had no sense of style, zero sense of style. In fact, the first time that Lincoln ever wore a suit that fit him was when he went to New York and gave his speech in New York City in 1860. Before that, his sleeves would come up to here, and his skin would show in his pants because it'd be like right here. He really hadn't, although despite him reading voraciously in terms of how he presented himself, he still looked like a country bumpkin. In fact, Lincoln never overcame his pronounced accent. In fact, some Yale and Harvard graduates would meet Lincoln in the White House, and they'd walk away saying the guy sounds like a Yahoo because of the way he sounded. Lincoln pronounced his name Linkhorn, Linkern or Linkhorn. And Joshua Speed taught Lincoln the importance of presenting oneself appropriately. Speed introduced Lincoln to Lord Byron, who was both in his poetry and his life considered one of the great freedom fighters. And Americans had a love affair with Lord Byron that, in my view, would still make a great book today. I mean, every American, if you had 5 books in your house, and I've come across yeoman farmers in Mississippi or in Georgia or in Alabama, they have 5 books. One's a Bible, one's Shakespeare, and one's Lord Byron.
What was it about Lord Byron?
Because he was a freedom fighter, because he championed the idea of freedom, and because Lord Byron, especially Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, was one of the early books that embraces the idea of self-making. of self-evolution.
Not to mention he had style.
Not to mention he had style. He's an aristocrat. And Lord Byron, in a sense, is the world's or the West's first pop star. There's a straight line from Lord Byron to Madonna.
Interesting.
Seriously.
But there were some, as a result of that close friendship with Joshua, though, there are some historians or some critics, maybe as opposed to historians, who wondered if that was not a homosexual relationship.
Yes, I discussed that in my book. I've gotten slammed for doing so. I argue that the very term homosexuality and heterosexuality didn't exist. In fact, the term homosexuality doesn't enter the English language until 1892, which means that most Americans did not define sexuality in terms of a binary. Also, most Americans did not politicize sexuality. For example, in 1862, Lincoln, who is wanting to appoint Joshua Speed's brother, James Speed, to office, which requires Senate approval, publicly in a speech says, "I know James Speed, I slept with Joshua for 4 years." And they did. They slept together in the same very small bed for 4 years, long after Lincoln could afford a bed of his own. And it was not uncommon for men who were in homosocial relationships, meaning they were primarily around other men, and so whether it's in the Navy or in the frontier, to have some sort of physical relationship. In many cases, it's what we would today call innocent. In some, it depends on who you are. And they didn't think anything of it. They didn't think, oh, by me, rubbing my hand over my male friend's chest means anything. It's simply, it was very common for two men to sleep together in the same bed. It was very common for two women to sleep together. Sexuality wasn't defined in the binary terms that it is today. Sexuality wasn't politicized, which was why Lincoln can say, "I slept with Joshua Speed for 4 years." How many politicians could say that today?
I know some who did say it, but we won't go into that. Let's talk politics a little bit here.
My point is that we don't know what happened with Lincoln and Speed, but a lot of scholars have said there's no way that they could have slept together because that would have meant Lincoln was gay. But my point is that sexuality is, our understanding of sexuality today is a historically bound definition. That what we mean by, most people mean by sexuality today had very different definitions and understandings then. And so the upshot is we don't know what happened, and Lincoln very well could have had some sort of an intimate male-male relationship with Joshua Speed. And what difference does it make? They wouldn't have seen themselves as different. They wouldn't have seen themselves as what we would now call gay or homosexual.
It's interesting because Joshua was really quite he was a slave owner, among other things.
He was a slave
owner.
The
ideology was not really...
Yes, they really grew far apart.
But speaking of that, the slavery issue, it's kind of difficult sometimes to understand why Frederick Douglass would eventually, or would be respecting Lincoln, because Lincoln he was not what you would call he certainly wasn't an abolitionist.
No.
And as a matter of fact, he voted to retain slave trade in the D.C. area.
Yep.
He did not support women or blacks' right to vote.
That's correct.
So tell me how Frederick Douglass came to respect Lincoln when they had such opposite views about slavery.
Great question. Douglass came to respect Lincoln because of the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation, which frees all slaves of rebel masters, and Lincoln never used the term Confederacy. He believed that Confederates were traitors, so he called them rebels. In Douglass's mind, even though the Emancipation Proclamation does not free a single slave in the border states, because Lincoln said that was unconstitutional. He used the War Power Clause of the Constitution. He said it was constitutional under the War Power Clause to liberate slaves of rebel masters. Douglass believed that the Emancipation Proclamation was the most important document in American history after the Declaration of Independence. In fact, Douglas said the Emancipation Proclamation should be celebrated with the Declaration of Independence as the twin birthdays of liberty, so to speak. And so his attitudes, and Douglas had been very critical of Lincoln from the beginning of the war until the Emancipation Proclamation, because Douglas believed as soon as Fort Sumter was fired upon, Douglas said the easiest way to win the war is to emancipate slaves. Because in order to win the war, you have 4 million slaves on your side. It's an easier way to achieve victory. And once Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, Douglas understands that Lincoln recognizes that his chief aim, which is winning the war, is impossible without the help and the aid of African Americans. That the 4 million slaves can be used in the service. And it wasn't just Douglas who was convincing Lincoln of that. Douglas sent every issue of his newspaper to the White House. But Lincoln's generals, who weren't even abolitionists, would say, you know, my job would be much easier if you emancipated slaves. So Douglas understood that this was a courageous and important gesture, and he understood that Lincoln, as president, was first and foremost a politician. And yet, Lincoln had the courage to understand that although his chief aim was to preserve the Union and to win the war, and that Lincoln was never a revolutionary.
Yeah, some people say, was he the great emancipator or a reluctant
Yes,
emancipator?
and reluctant emancipator. And Douglas, at the same time he embraces the Emancipation Proclamation as one of the great documents, said, it's absurd to think that Lincoln or any other single individual could free 4 million. And that's still a common view among a lot of white Americans. Lincoln freed the slaves. Douglas said that's absurd.
Right.
Lincoln is important, emancipation is important, but slaves on the ground are crucially important. They take advantage of an opportunity. I mean, think about it. If you're a slave in Georgia, before the Civil War, for you to get free, you got to go 1,000 miles through enemy territory. A lot of them say the risk isn't worth it.
Right.
I'm going to die. You know, slavery's horrible, but I'd rather live than die. Suddenly the war breaks out, and instead of having to travel thousands of miles, all you have to do is travel 50 miles because the Union Army is 50 miles away, or 25 miles away. And I can be put to your service in the Union Army.
As a matter of fact, Abraham Lincoln asked Douglas, did he not, to do a kind of a John Brown
Exactly.
plan.
Exactly. Exactly.
Let's talk about that.
So the second meeting, the first meeting is Douglas goes to Washington to see Lincoln himself. He's upset with Lincoln because despite the Emancipation Proclamation, which also calls for the arming of blacks as soldiers.
Right.
Black soldiers are being paid half of what white soldiers are paid, and they're not promoted for
And
valiant
Lincoln
service.
did not want to arm black soldiers.
And Lincoln did not want to arm, partly because Lincoln said, you know, I'm dealing with, I need to deal with the border states. And
Yeah.
because of the racism, you know, if I put a gun in the hands of a black and tell them to shoot and kill whites, a lot of people are going to be upset with me. And so the Emancipation Proclamation calls for the arming of black soldiers, although they're still treated as second-class citizens, as soldiers. And so Douglas goes to the White House. Douglas almost single-handedly recruits the famous Massachusetts 54th Black Regiment. 2 sons are among the first 2 recruits. And he says to Lincoln, you know, I've been heavily recruiting, devoting full-time to recruiting. I'm going to quit because you're paying blacks half of what whites are paid. Their first meeting was over an hour meeting, and Lincoln essentially defended his tardiness, defended his position, and they left that first hour meeting not agreeing politically, but having great respect for each other. In fact, after that first meeting, Lincoln says to the next person he sees in the White House, he said, I just had a long meeting with Frederick Douglass, who I consider to be the most meritorious man in these United States. You can't ask for higher praise than that. And Douglas says later that day, I just had a meeting with President Lincoln, who I consider to be the king of self-made men. The second meeting, which is a year later, this meeting, Lincoln sends a telegraph to Douglas's home in Rochester saying, please come to Washington, I need you. This meeting is an all-expense-paid trip by the White House. Douglas arrives in D.C. There's a presidential carriage waiting to take him to the White House. He gets to the White House. This is August of '64. Now, if you know the Civil War, you know August of '64. It's one of the nadirs of the war. Lincoln is sure he's going to lose re-election because Northerners are tired of fighting. Grant is just is tied up in the Wilderness Campaign. The casualties are breathtakingly bad. And Lincoln is certain he's going to lose to a Democrat. Democratic candidate is George McClellan. And the Democratic platform is negotiated settlement, let's end this war. And had McClellan won the presidency, almost certainly that would have in effect meant victory for the Confederacy because it would have allowed the Confederacy to remain a separate nation with slavery intact. And Lincoln knew that. So Lincoln asked Douglas, he says, I want you to embark upon a John Brown scheme in which you select some hand-picked men to go into the South and bring back as many blacks into Union lines as possible. Best case scenario, these blacks will form regiments, help us achieve a major military victory that will turn the tide of public opinion and allow me to get reelected, in which I will then carry forward my platform, which at this point was the 13th Amendment, the amendment that abolishes slavery. Worst case scenario is I lose, Democrats elected, Confederacy remains a separate nation, and slavery's intact. Thousands more blacks will be brought to Union lines and thus freedom. And Douglas says, after this meeting, he said, I never understood the degree to which Lincoln hated slavery as at that moment. Now, can I say one more thing about...
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think the best, to this day, I think the best assessment of Lincoln is by Frederick Douglass in 1876, in the anniversary of Lincoln's assassination and the commemoration of the Freedmen's Monument in Washington, D.C. How many of you have seen the Freedmen's Monument in D.C.? Most of the heads of state are there. President Grant unveils the monument. Congress, Supreme Court, almost all of the nation's leaders are there. Douglas gives the keynote address. He begins his address by saying to all these white heads of state, he says, Lincoln, he said, you are Lincoln's children. We, blacks, are Lincoln's stepchildren. And I can imagine, Grant and these others just, their jaws dropping, because this is supposed to be a tribute, which is essentially to say Lincoln was the white man's president, not the black man's president. His chief aim was not our interests. But then Douglas says that part of Lincoln's brilliance was, despite this fact, he understood that in order to preserve the Union, in order to maintain his faith and his dedication to white Americans, he needed to bring blacks into the American family. So although he is the white man's president, he becomes the black man's president in order to preserve the Union.
But Lincoln believed in a gradual emancipation.
He did agree.
And
yes,
briefly
absolutely.
speak about what that meant and how long he thought it might take for that
so
to be complete.
Before the war, one of the reasons that Douglas was so critical of Lincoln is that Lincoln says he hates slavery as much as any abolitionist. There's no reason to doubt that. For Douglas, the problem was Lincoln's solution to slavery. Lincoln had a three-pronged strategy for ending slavery. One, it should be very gradual, over a series of generations so as to not uproot the existing social order so that slave owners are not disadvantaged. And in fact, Lincoln, in his debates with Stephen Douglas, when pressed about when the ultimate extinction of slavery will occur, Lincoln responds, not less than 100 years. Not less than 100 years at the earliest. meaning that would put emancipation at the earliest in 1958. Now,
And if you think about it, that's just about the time
that's
the
exactly,
voting rights
that's
and
just
everything.
about the time when black freedom does come about. And so from Lincoln's perspective, that's just a little too tardy.
One of the things that, and I hate to cut across you, but I want to touch on this. One of the things that Frederick Douglass and Lincoln both agreed on was colonization.
Exactly. Douglass, yeah, so Douglass, the other prong of Lincoln's strategy is that when blacks are emancipated, they should be shipped over, they should be colonized back to Africa. In essence, Lincoln could not envision, until well into the Civil War, he could not envision an American democracy that included blacks and whites. His vision for American democracy was a white male democracy. And here Lincoln was representative. 98% of all Republicans who are anti-slavery believed the same thing. So to be an abolitionist was truly radical. Douglass ultimately embraced emigration only when he believed that the nation's ideals as articulated in the Declaration could never be fulfilled. And in fact, the closest Frederick Douglass ever comes to emigrating, moving to Haiti, the world's first, West's first black republic, is right after he reads Lincoln's first inaugural address. And why is Douglass so outraged about Lincoln's first inaugural? Lincoln is giving this inaugural address. The audience is primarily Southerners because 5 states have seceded. The Confederacy has already been formed. Lincoln is wanting to conciliate. And Lincoln says 2 things in that first inaugural that just outraged Douglass. One is he says, I will vigorously reinforce the fugitive slave law. I'll even give it more teeth. And Douglass, along with most other, almost every other abolitionist, and even many progressive Republicans like Salmon Chase and William Seward and Charles Sumner, believed that the fugitive slave law was unconstitutional.
And that meant the fugitive slave law said?
Fugitive slave law said that essentially it legitimated the kidnapping of free blacks. It meant that if a white man went into the North and rounded up a black and said, this is my former slave, it bypassed trial by jury, suspended habeas corpus. Instead of a judge overseeing the case, a special prosecutor oversaw the case, and the special prosecutor got twice as much money to send the suspect back into slavery. And the law also required that every Northerner participate in rounding up suspected fugitives at the expense of a $1,000 fine, which is equivalent to $75,000 in today's money. And if you were caught aiding and abetting a fugitive, you got a minimum of 5-year prison sentence. So it truly transformed Northern opinion. The law was designed and passed on the behest of Southerners, but in my view it became suicidal. Nothing so galvanized Northern anti-slavery opinion as the fugitive slave law. In fact, there are tens of thousands of upstanding Bostonians who thought themselves law-abiding surround the courthouse during the trials of Anthony Burns and Thomas Sims, flagrantly revoking the fugitive slave law, hoping to take Sims or Anthony Burns to safety, to freedom, to Canada. In my view, the closest equivalent of the fugitive slave law and how Bostonians responded would have been had Teddy Kennedy, the liberal senator of Massachusetts, stood up in the Senate after the Patriot Act had passed and told all of his constituents in Massachusetts to flagrantly ignore the Patriot Act. And that's anarchy. Now, Lincoln, even though the law itself is unconstitutional, it's still a federal law. So Douglass is outraged about that. More importantly, in his inaugural address, Lincoln says in his inaugural address that he endorses this new constitutional amendment. Congress also was seeking to conciliate with the Southerners who had seceded, and the Congress had passed the first 13th Amendment. Now, most of you know of the 13th Amendment as the one that abolishes slavery. The first 13th Amendment, passed by Congress a few weeks before Lincoln's inaugural but never ratified, was an amendment that guarantees slavery in the slave states forever.
Forever.
Forever. And Lincoln, in his inaugural address, says, I have no problem with this amendment. And Douglas says, that's it, I'm out of here. I'm going to Haiti.
We're almost out of time. So how did he win Douglas's respect, though, after that? And
So he wins Douglas's respect primarily because of Douglas's Emancipation Proclamation. From that moment, from Douglas's response to Lincoln's first inaugural until Lincoln announces his Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, Douglas on numerous occasions said that Abraham Lincoln is a representative American racist. After Emancipation Proclamation, Douglas's attitudes towards Lincoln completely and irrevocably change. He never again criticizes Lincoln in the degree he had before, even though they never agree politically. Douglas calls for immediate suffrage for all people, all blacks, men and women. Lincoln, by the end of his life, says, well, I think that soldiers should receive the suffrage, and the intelligent blacks should receive the suffrage. And that's it. So they never agree politically. But they genuinely liked each other. They had great respect for each other. Lincoln met with more blacks in the White House than all previous presidents combined, and everyone who met with him, from Sojourner Truth to Henry Highland Garnett, said, regardless of Lincoln's political views, he treated me like a man or a woman, not like a black man or woman.
that might be one of the reasons why President Obama admires Lincoln so much. As a matter of fact, he often cites Douglas and Lincoln
Yes.
in his
Yes.
talks.
Yes.
Why do you think Obama relates to these two men so much?
That's a great question. I think without the legacies of Douglas and Lincoln, Obama never could have been elected president. And so I'll explain that. We all know that Obama is deeply inspired and indebted to Lincoln. He eats on the Lincoln Silver. He took the oath of office on the Lincoln Bible. He took a train route to Washington modeled after Lincoln's train route to the White House. He announces his presidential campaign in Springfield invoking Lincoln. Another self-made man came here, or announced his presidency before me. And what he admires in Lincoln is Lincoln's pragmatism, and more specifically, Lincoln's quest to move beyond the horrible social divisions in order to achieve a broad understanding in his quest to reunite or to unite Americans across these horrible ideological political divides, which requires the ability to compromise and pragmatism. Now, Obama has not publicly acknowledged his debt to Frederick Douglass very much, although in The Audacity of Hope, Obama has said that from Frederick Douglass, I learned that in certain circumstances, power will concede nothing without a fight. And like Frederick Douglass, Obama understands that the most effective way of fighting power is with language, with words. In many respects, I think Barack Obama is a direct successor of Frederick Douglass. Like Frederick Douglass and Lincoln, he's one of the great self-made men of our day. His father abandons him when he's a kid. His mom relies on welfare for a while. He rises up with the help of fellowships and becomes a president of the United States. Obama is, even his opponents in the election, even today, well, less today, but during the campaign, even Republicans would acknowledge that Obama was a brilliant public orator. In fact, they tried to downplay it. It's only words, they'd say. And also, like Frederick Douglass, and this is, well, like Frederick Douglass, Obama becomes world famous before the age of 40, in part on the strength of a best-selling autobiography.
Interesting.
And I think also important, and it's why Obama, at least during the campaign, was so disciplined as a public speaker. Obama understood something that Frederick Douglass said. Frederick Douglass said that true art can break down racial barriers. And by that, what Douglass meant is that when Douglass would come up on stage to speak, he understood that his white audiences, in theory, believed that blacks were subhuman. That's how racist white America was then. So Douglass understood that when he spoke, he was fortunate in being very good looking. Obama's like that. Even his enemies say, oh, he's handsome. When Douglass spoke, he would transform his audience. It was music to the ears of his listeners. They would forget about Douglass's color. And there are countless instances where Douglass would speak to the multitude, converting them to the cause of anti-slavery. True art could break down racial barriers. And similarly, in the campaign, I think there's a big difference between public speaking in a campaign where you have a lot more time and freedom than as president. But there are numerous instances when Obama, during the campaign, would speak to audiences and whites would be interviewed before hearing or witnessing Obama's magic, so to speak, and say, well, I can't see myself voting for a black man. And then they see Obama. They witness his brilliance as a performer. And it had a profound effect in the results at the polls.
Well, I wish we could go on, but unfortunately we are out of time.
So let me just end by saying, I have a little crib sheet. Frederick Douglass and Lincoln not only have greatly inspired Obama, regardless of whether or not you like him as president, whether you're Republican or Democrat or something else. I think Douglass and Lincoln could and should continue to inspire us as Americans. Hopefully they will inspire us to bind up the nation's wounds and to complete the unfinished work by fulfilling the ideals of freedom and equality of opportunity for all. Thanks.
Do we still have time for a couple of questions? Okay.
Yes. Even at the end of his life, Lincoln was advocating colonization. There is that understanding is based upon the account of of Benjamin Butler, who in his memoirs a number of years later said that he met with Lincoln near the end of his life, and Lincoln asked, essentially, run the numbers, would colonization work? And a lot of historians have said, well, Butler's memories are faulty, we're unsure. I could see Lincoln saying that. I could see Lincoln saying, well, Lincoln understood the degree to which the American society was simply marinated in racism, and Lincoln was never a revolutionary. I could see Lincoln saying, run the numbers on colonization. Lincoln and Douglass never agree politically. It's also true that Lincoln did support a scheme for colonizing a group of freedmen in what was known, the translation is Cowes Island near Haiti. I mean, Lincoln should have known by the name alone that this was a stupid idea. And most of the immigrants there died. It was a horrible failure, and this occurred. Lincoln didn't realize, or no one realized the failure of it, the degree of death, until after he had passed the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, he was truly a colonizationist until well into 1863, and until he, after passing the Emancipation Proclamation, and then essentially abandons colonization. And Douglass understood that. Douglass understood that to advocate for full suffrage for blacks, to advocate for racial equality, for blacks to be full citizens before the law in a democracy, that's a radical revolutionary gesture, even during the Civil War. But Douglass also recognized that Lincoln had, at the same time, experienced a revolutionary move from not being able to imagine an interracial nation at all before the war. In Lincoln's view, and in most northern whites' views, democracy would be lily white. at least Lincoln could begin to imagine an interracial nation, even though there were ambiguities there. So that's how I'd answer the third question. In the second question, the quote that you gave actually is from that Freedman's Monument speech. So read the end of that speech. As I said, Douglas begins the speech by saying, "We are Lincoln's stepchildren. He's the white man's president, not the black man's president." But essentially, he says that part of the reason why I like Lincoln, why I so respect Lincoln, is that he understands that in order to preserve the Union, he has to make blacks part of the national family, because Lincoln, to his credit, understands in order to win the war, he needed blacks on his side. And part of Douglas's friendship with Lincoln also stemmed from the fact that he understood, despite his differences, that in order for Douglas to achieve his chief aim of freeing the slaves and achieving racial equality, he needed Lincoln, he needed the president on his side. So it was truly a utilitarian friendship, which is why, despite their political differences, Douglas understood that, yeah, Lincoln is not perfect. Lincoln is a far cry from me, but let's face it, we could have a lot worse than Lincoln. And he was hired out with Covey. There's evidence that Douglas never knew who his father was. His father was a white man, and he suspected that he was his master, which would have been either Aaron Anthony or Thomas Auld. In one speech in England, Douglas says, "Thomas Auld is my father." But he never says that again. And after his fight with Covey, and it's true that most other blacks who fought a master would get killed or dismembered or sent down the river. There are two reasons why Douglas wasn't. One is that Covey's reputation hinged on the fact that he was known as a slave breaker. Covey ended up making a lot of money on that reputation. If you had what was called an insolent slave, you sent him to Covey to get broken in. And Covey knew that if he divulged the fact that, this 16-year-old boy whipped him, that would destroy his reputation of a slave breaker. And in fact, Covey himself became a great self-made man, Southern style. By the eve of the Civil War, Covey owned numerous slaves and in today's dollars was a multimillionaire. Covey's home, because of Douglas's influence, became known as Mount Misery. In fact, Covey's home on Eastern Shore, Maryland, was known as Mount Misery throughout the 20th century. And one anecdote is that in 2000, Donald Rumsfeld purchased Mount Misery, which I find interesting. Thomas Auld, where we know that one of the indications that Thomas Auld may have been Douglas's father is after his fight with Covey, the white masters on the Eastern Shore of Maryland were so mad at Douglas and so worried that Douglas was going to recruit other slaves to engage in a major rebellion that they threatened to murder Douglas. And they told Hugh Auld that, or Thomas Auld that. And so Thomas Auld, instead of whipping Douglas or sending him to another slave breaker, Thomas Auld says to Douglas, just take it easy, I'll give you your freedom by age 21. That's almost unheard of. He threatens to send Douglas down to Mississippi, from which there's no way he could have escaped. 99% of all slaves who successfully reached freedom came from the border states, which suggests that Auld had a truly emotional attachment and was looking out for Douglas's well-being, which suggests he was his father, which is why I call Douglas a privileged slave. I mean, the vast majority of slaves were field hands, they were callously sold right and left. Douglas was kept in the family. So those are three great questions.
Which Lincoln does a middle school instructor teach and how?
That's a great question.
Speak to us of Frederick Douglass' second wife
Helen Pitts, okay.
and
Okay.
the African American community's response to her.
Right. Great. These are great questions. So the answer to the first is that I wanted to do two overarching things in this book. One is I wanted to show through the story that Frederick Douglass, in his own way, was as important an American as Abraham Lincoln, as important to American society as Abraham Lincoln, and that was contributing to our understanding. Lincoln's harder. There's been 10,000 books written on Lincoln, and what I felt I tried to do, I felt I did, is that I think the vast majority of scholarship on Lincoln casts him as a myth. He's romanticized. Most white Americans to this day, as I said it before, they say Lincoln freed the slaves. In the minds of most biographers of Lincoln, Lincoln could do no wrong. Everything he did as president, as a politician, was just spot on perfect. And that's to create a myth, because part of being human is to make mistakes, to be flawed, to be deeply flawed. And because I was describing them as self-made men, I felt that by highlighting Lincoln's flaws, which was easy to do because I'm focusing on Lincoln from Frederick Douglass's perspective, I would come away with a more profound, richer, more ambiguous appreciation of Lincoln. He's no longer this myth, but someone who was deeply flawed. Certainly doesn't share most of our views today about equality under the law. But I felt that by highlighting Lincoln's flaws and mistakes and shortcomings, we see how far he came. I completely agree with W.B. Du Bois, who said that to appreciate Lincoln, you have to understand that where Lincoln could have gone. Most of Lincoln's peers who started life like Lincoln did became Southern slave owners. In many respects, Lincoln's counterpart is Nathan Bedford Forrest. Nathan Bedford Forrest was born in a log cabin in a border state, dirt poor like Lincoln. Nathan Bedford Forrest had less than a year of formal education like Lincoln. Unlike Lincoln, Nathan Bedford Forrest defined self-making as getting rich, and he got rich on the backs of slaves. Nathan Bedford Forrest became one of the South's major slave traders by the eve of the Civil War, multimillionaire. During the war was a Confederate cavalry general, and after the war, Nathan Bedford Forrest helped found the Ku Klux Klan. Yes, and Forrest did not even recognize black soldiers as soldiers, executed them. That's where Lincoln could have gone. That's where most Southerners, because Lincoln really was Southern. Most settlers in Indiana, where Lincoln grew up, were Southern. That's where Lincoln could have gone. He went a different direction. Lincoln defined self-making the same way that Douglass did. It's not about what you can do for yourself. It's not about getting rich. The true self-made man, Douglass says, is one who seeks to eradicate the sins of his society. And Lincoln, even though he was very tardy and didn't go nearly far enough from Douglass's perspective, still went radically farther, far farther than most of his peers. Helen Pitts, sorry. So Helen Pitts, Helen Pitts is, Anna Murray dies in, I remember, 1881, and Douglass truly mourned. Douglass got depressed. I mean, in his own way, he did love her. He married Helen Pitts a little more than a year later, and from our perspective today, it was not a politically correct marriage. Helen Pitts had been Douglass's secretary, and she was 20 years his junior. She was a white woman. Douglass got vigorously critiqued for, both by blacks and by whites. And Douglass did not handle it as well as he could have. I mean, what he could have said is, I've devoted my whole life to champion integration. What better model of integration than choosing a white wife? Instead, Douglas responds by saying, well, the first wife, I married a woman of the hue of my mother, a black. The second wife, I choose someone the hue of my father. So blacks are really upset. Whites are really upset because by the time he married her, every southern state had passed miscegenation laws. But what's interesting is that Douglas and Helen Pitts, they were truly kindred spirits. She was a radical. She was a reformer. They loved to read. She was a voracious reader. She had been a reformer her whole career. They traveled together. They were true soulmates. And it was Helen Pitts who ensured that Douglas's home, Cedar Hill, would be dedicated as a National Historic Site. She gave it to the government and made every effort to bring it into the National Park Service. So that's the short answer about Helen Pitts.
Just a P.S. to that, Ottilie.
Ottilie Ossing. Yes, yes, I say this book. So Ottilie Ossing, as soon as she hears that Helen Pitts and Douglas have married,
This is the woman who had the 28-year
relations for friendship with Douglas. She's back in Germany. She hears of their marriage, and she commits suicide.
Good evening. Thank you both for being here. And I just was wondering, had Lincoln lived during his second term, I was wondering what Douglas's role might have been. Had he been more involved with Reconstruction? And also, what did you enjoy most about the research and writing this book?
Had Lincoln lived, what was Douglas? Is your question, would Douglas's role have been in Reconstruction?
Might have been more involved in Lincoln's administration, or perhaps.
Yes, so it's a great question, and I get it. I've gotten it a lot. Had Lincoln lived, it's difficult to know how things might have been different. What we do know about Lincoln, one of the things that I emphasize is Lincoln's capacity for change. Lincoln was someone who, like Douglas, they continually evolved. Who Lincoln was in 1830 was very different than 40 and 1850 and 60. But Lincoln's policy, when he died, his policy about Reconstruction was basically the same as Andrew Johnson's. We know, though, that Andrew Johnson was a virulent racist. Douglas met Andrew Johnson at Lincoln's second inaugural. And it was in the morning, and according to Douglas, Andrew Johnson was already drunk. And when he meets Douglas, Johnson's whole face turns into a sneer. And Douglas says to the friend he's with, he says, whatever else Andrew Johnson is, he's no friend of the black man. In my view, I think Lincoln could well have appointed Douglas to federal office. I mean, Douglas, as it was, became the first black man to be appointed to a federal post that required Senate approval when he was made Marshal of the District of Columbia, but that was in 1874. So I think, I'm almost certain, in fact, in speculating, I feel quite confident in saying that Douglas and Lincoln's friendship certainly would have persisted after their third meeting, because the third meeting, it was at the second inaugural, and then Douglas attends the reception at the White House after first being turned away by a policeman who says no blacks are allowed to enter, and he's able to come in, and Lincoln is in the elegant East Room surrounded by a crowd of whites and sees Douglas, and he raises his hand. He says, "Here comes my friend, Frederick Douglass. What did you think of my inaugural address? There is no man in these United States whose opinion I value more than yours." And Douglas responds that was a sacred address, or a sacred sermon, sacred effort. So you have a better memory than me. And So, that conveys the sense of their respect for each other. And your second question?
What did you enjoy most about the
So what I enjoyed most, I had already written a lot on Frederick Douglass. I think that what I enjoyed most, first, is their language. I adore reading Frederick Douglass. I first started reading Frederick Douglass when I was 13. I moved all over the place in the Midwest, and a friend gave me Douglass's narrative, and it was amazingly inspirational. In a weird way, I saw myself in Frederick Douglass, even though he's a slave at the time. Even now, if I get depressed, if I feel blue, I start reading Frederick Douglass. He is, in my view, he remains one of the great nonfiction writers. And Lincoln, I also love reading. So I'd say the most enjoyable part was the pure pleasure of reading them. And the second most enjoyable part about working on the book is the process of discovering the rich parallels of their lives. This black slave and this white man who becomes president, in really weird, striking ways, actually had some many parallels. And I had no idea really about that until I started. Initially, I was asked by Time magazine to write about them, and I knew that they both loved to read, but I didn't know they loved to read the same books. And so those are the two most enjoyable parts of the writing.
Can you talk about how at Lincoln's first inaugural, or when he's elected, what the abolitionists' response was? I mean, both Douglass, obviously he was quite upset with the inauguration, but the election, the South was so sure that Lincoln was an abolitionist that they started seceding.
Right. They already had by the time of the inaugural.
Yeah, basically after the election. So that in that process, I mean, how were the abolitionists? What were their expectations between
That's a great
November
question.
and April?
So, what were the expectations of the abolitionists in response to Lincoln's inaugural address? Many of them were, like Douglass, outraged. Wendell Phillips, the well-known, one of the most at the time famous white abolitionists, said that Lincoln was a two-bit politician and a slave hound from Illinois. He never really overcame his dislike for Lincoln. William Lloyd Garrison was very disappointed by the inaugural address, but was much more hopeful because for Lincoln's presidency was the first time in American history in which the basic platform of the party, the central platform of Lincoln's campaign, was that slavery was evil. Slavery was a moral and economic evil. That was the first time that any president had stated that. So he wasn't an abolitionist, but it's still a huge step forward. So the abolitionist groups, blacks and whites, were divided. They were certainly disappointed by the address, but some remained cautiously hopeful, whereas for Douglass, he was, that's it. And Douglass ended up not going to Haiti because Fort Sumner was fired upon, and Douglass understood that with war, there was a golden opportunity to end slavery. So that's a great question.
All right. Good.